The Wendigo's Hunger, Summer Descent. Prologue, The Forgotten Stories. Every mountain town has its legends. Every isolated community passes down stories meant to keep children close and safe. In the heart of the Rocky Mountains, where civilization thins to nothing but pine and stone, there's a particular tale that locals tell with unsettling certainty. It's not presented as folklore. It's presented as fact. They talk about the disappearances. 23 people in the last 90 years. Hikers who ventured too deep. Campers who didn't return. Families who took one wrong turn on unmarked trails and were simply swallowed by the wilderness. The official reports blamed weather, terrain, and human error. But the locals knew better. They knew what lived in those forests, what hunted there. The Wendigo. Most people dismissed it as a campfire story, a rustic embellishment designed to thrill tourists and keep naive travelers away from restricted areas. A boogeyman for the modern age. That's what Sarah Chen thought when she first heard it at a small lodge in Colorado, 2 weeks before everything changed. She was 25 years old, beautiful in that effortless way that comes from genuine confidence and an unquenchable love of life. Her Instagram was a testament to wanderlust. Summits conquered, sunrises captured, landscapes that took your breath away. She had quit her corporate job in Seattle 6 months ago to pursue what she called authentic existence.
Solo travel. No guides, no companions, no distractions.
Just her, the wild, and whatever discoveries awaited. Sarah had dismissed the Wendigo story the same way she dismissed most warnings. With a smile and a certainty that nothing bad would happen to her. She was careful, she told herself. Experienced. She had hiked every major trail in the Pacific Northwest. She had navigated whitewater in summer floods, summit peaks that would intimidate most people, camped alone in grizzly country. This would be no different. She was catastrophically, fatally wrong. Part 1, The Trail. The Crimson Ridge Trail wasn't officially on any map anymore. That should have been her first warning. The National Forest Service had quietly decommissioned it in 2001, removing markers and posting occasional signs requesting hikers not use the route. Officially, the reason was erosion and safety concerns. But the ranger who reluctantly gave Sarah directions at the Boulder office had hesitated before providing coordinates. He'd looked at her in a way she couldn't quite interpret. Not judgmental, not dismissive, something closer to pity. That trail's not maintained, he'd said carefully. There are better alternatives. But the trail had exactly what Sarah wanted. Isolation, challenge, and a route that would take her through untouched wilderness for 3 full days before emerging near Estes Park.
No crowds.
No other hikers. Just raw, genuine wilderness. And in late July, with clear skies and warm temperatures, it seemed like the perfect time. She'd started on a Thursday morning in mid-July. The weather forecast called for typical summer conditions. Hot days, cool nights, maybe afternoon thunderstorms possible in the mountains, but nothing serious. Her gear was solid. She carried 4 days of supplies, a satellite communicator, a quality knife, bear spray, and a pistol, legal in Colorado if you knew how to carry it safely, and Sarah did. The first day was magnificent. The kind of day that reminded her why she'd abandoned her comfortable life. The meadows were exploding with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and columbine and lupin in shades of red and blue and purple. The afternoon light was golden and perfect. She hiked 12 miles and camped near an alpine lake so clear she could see the trout darting in the shallows. She took photos that would garner 5,000 likes. She wrote in her journal about the profound beauty of solitude. She swam naked in the lake as the sun descended, feeling utterly alive, utterly free. The second day was when things started to feel wrong. She'd woken at dawn to find the forest transformed. Not by weather, the sky was still clear, still blue, but by something else. The ambient sounds had changed. The birds that had filled the previous day with song were silent. No squirrels chattered. No chipmunks called. The forest was muted, waiting. She told herself it was normal. Animals had patterns, quieter times. She packed quickly and began hiking, pushing herself into a good pace. The trail was well marked up here, the terrain relatively easy. By midday, she'd covered 10 miles and was feeling strong. That's when she found the first body. It was a deer, a young mule deer buck, lying in a meadow just off the trail. At first, she thought it had simply died, starvation, disease, or old age. But as she got closer, she realized what had actually happened. The corpse was torn open. Its ribs were splayed outward like someone had deliberately pried them apart. The organs were missing, not scattered about, but removed with deliberate care. Most disturbing was the head. The eyes were gone. Only empty sockets remained, along with a precise surgical removal of the tongue. Sarah's mind tried to process what she was seeing. This wasn't a normal predator kill. Mountain lions brought down deer, sure, but they fed differently. Bears would scavenge but wouldn't do this. This was methodical. This was something else. She backed away from the corpse, her hand moving to her bear spray without her consciously deciding to do so. The day was hot, the sun directly overhead, everything around her bright and exposed. Yet she felt a shadow of dread that had nothing to do with weather. She started walking faster, moving off the meadow and back into the trees. The forest felt different than it had that morning. Less welcoming. The shadows seemed deeper despite the bright sunlight. The air felt heavy, despite the warm temperature. By late afternoon, she saw the second kill. A porcupine this time, meticulously dissected, its quills carefully removed and arranged in patterns on the rocky ground. Someone or something had spent considerable time and effort on this. It wasn't a feeding. It was something else. Something that suggested intention, planning, intelligence. Sarah made camp early, while daylight remained. She chose a location in a dense stand of conifers, built a fire even though the evening was warm, and kept her pistol close. She tried to eat, but her stomach rejected the food. She told herself the mutilated animals were probably the work of some local predator with unusual hunting behaviors. She told herself she was being paranoid. But as darkness fell and the stars emerged in the crystal-clear sky, she heard the first sound. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, carried on the warm night breeze. A sound like wind through a canyon, except there was no canyon here. Like something between a howl and a moan, stretched and distorted. It lasted for maybe 5 seconds, then faded. Sarah sat by her fire, her pistol in her lap, and tried to convince herself it was a coyote or a distressed animal. She knew better than to believe her own explanations. Part 2. The encounter. The third day began with a sense of urgency that Sarah couldn't quite articulate. She was packed and hiking before 7 in the morning, needing to cover ground, needing to get out. Her GPS said she still had about 18 miles to the trailhead. In normal conditions, that would be more than a day's hike, but she was moving faster now, fueled by an instinct that was screaming at her to get away. The day was hot. By 10 in the morning, temperatures were pushing into the high 80s. The sun was relentless, beating down through the canopy where trees didn't provide shade. Sarah was sweating through her shirt, her water consumption higher than she'd planned. She rationed her remaining supplies, trying to calculate if she had enough to push through to the trailhead by evening. Around midday, she descended into a deep canyon where a creek ran during spring snowmelt. It was mostly dry now in the summer heat, but there were pools of stagnant water in shaded areas. She refilled her bottles, knowing the water was probably not perfectly safe but needing the hydration more than she needed perfect safety. She just finished filling her containers when she heard the footsteps. They were bipedal. That was the first thing that registered in her shocked brain. Footsteps that weren't paw prints. Footsteps from something that walked on 2 legs, moving through the dry creek bed behind her. Sarah turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her pistol. First, she saw nothing, just the creek bed and rocks and the canyon wall. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it standing in the shadow of an overhang maybe 60 yards away. Her mind tried to process what she was seeing. At first, she thought it was a human. Bipedal, roughly human-shaped, standing maybe 7 feet tall. Her survival instinct wanted desperately to categorize it as a person. Perhaps a park ranger, perhaps another hiker, perhaps someone lost like her. Then it moved, and she knew nothing human moved like that. Its limbs seemed too long, proportioned wrong, articulating at angles that suggested too many joints. Its head was disproportionately large compared to its body, and its face, God, its face, was a nightmare amalgamation of features that shouldn't coexist. The bone structure suggested something between a deer and a human and something else, something that had never evolved naturally. Its skin was gray and translucent, with what looked like veins visible beneath the surface, glowing faintly even in daylight. Its eyes were too large and had a sickly yellow-green luminescence that seemed to draw in light rather than reflect it. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth that seemed to go back forever, an impossible number of them arranged in rows like some prehistoric predator. Sarah's body reacted before her mind could process a decision. She ran. She didn't climb up the canyon wall. She didn't try to reach higher ground. She ran back the way she'd come, back toward the trail, her heart hammering in her chest like it was trying to escape her body. Her water bottles slipped from her hands as she moved, forgotten, inconsequential. Nothing mattered but forward movement, distance, survival. She burst onto the trail and kept running, pushing her legs harder than she'd ever pushed them, ignoring the burning in her muscles, ignoring the risk of falling on the rocky terrain. Behind her, she didn't hear pursuit. That was somehow worse than if she had. She could feel that presence anyway, that vast and hungry attention tracking her through the forest. The canyon fell away behind her, and the terrain opened up slightly. She ran for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. She ran until her body simply gave out and she collapsed beside the trail, gasping for air, her vision tunneling with shock and adrenaline. She was going to die. The certainty of it was absolute. But she didn't die. Not then, anyway. What happened instead was almost stranger. She waited in that spot for 20 minutes, gasping for breath, expecting the thing to emerge from the forest and finish what it had begun. But nothing emerged. The forest returned to its strange, oppressive silence. The sense of being hunted evaporated as suddenly as it had arrived. Sarah sat beside the trail for a long time, shaking, trying to convince herself she'd hallucinated the whole thing. Heat stroke could do that. Dehydration could do that. Fear and exhaustion could conspire to create vivid false memories. But she knew what she'd seen, and she knew with equal certainty that it was letting her live. For now, as the afternoon heat intensified, Sarah took stock of her situation. She'd lost her water bottles in her panic. She still had about a quart in the reservoir in her pack, enough if she was conservative. Her GPS showed the trailhead was approximately 14 miles away, southeast. If she pushed hard and didn't stop for breaks, she could make it before dark. She could get out before nightfall. She forced herself to eat half a protein bar despite her stomach's protests. She drank sparingly from her water supply. She began moving again, walking quickly but carefully, trying to maintain a pace she could sustain. By late afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, she noticed something unusual. There were markers in the trees. Not official trail markers, those were blazes of paint on tree trunks. These were different, carved symbols, deliberately placed at regular intervals, leading off the main trail and deeper into the forest. Sarah knew she should ignore them. Every instinct screamed at her to stay on the established path, to keep moving toward the trailhead. But something about the symbols nagged at her. They were old, worn by weather, suggesting they'd been maintained for years. Decades, maybe. She followed them. The symbols led her upward, toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. The trail was steep and overgrown, clearly unused by regular hikers. But the symbols were there, carved into trees every 30 yards or so, marking the way. Near the top of the ridge, Sarah found a structure. It was old, perhaps 50 years or more, built of wood and stone in a way that suggested considerable effort. It was partially collapsed, open to the elements, but its purpose was clear. It had been a shelter, a watchtower of some kind, the kind of place someone would build if they were trying to protect themselves from something, or to observe something. Inside the ruin, she found a journal wrapped in oilcloth, protected from the weather and time. Sarah sat in the ruins of that structure as the sun descended toward the mountains, and she read what had been written there decades ago. Part 3, The Journal. The entry spanned almost 3 years, from June 1970 to April 1973. The author was identified as Robert Ashford, a National Forest Ranger. His handwriting was precise and controlled at first, becoming increasingly erratic as the journal progressed. The early entries described his job, routine patrols, maintenance work, the occasional lost hiker he'd helped find their way back. Then, in late summer of 1970, the tone changed. He'd started investigating disappearances. 3 hikers missing in the previous 2 years. Searches had found no bodies, no clear evidence of foul play. The official conclusion was that they'd gotten lost and died in the wilderness, their remains undiscovered in the vast forest. But Ashford wasn't satisfied with that conclusion. He'd found evidence. tracks that weren't normal, animals that had been killed in ways that suggested intention rather than predation. He'd interviewed locals, older people who'd lived in the mountains their whole lives. He'd found references in Native American traditions to something called the Wendigo, a creature that existed in the deep wilderness, that hunted humans, that was intelligent and purposeful and essentially immortal. By the winter of 1970, Ashford had seen it. His description matched what Sarah had witnessed in the canyon. The thing is impossible. There's no biological framework for what I've observed. It's bipedal but not human. Its anatomy suggests predator, but evolved along a completely different evolutionary path. Its intelligence is undeniable. It watches with purpose. It hunts with strategy. Ashford had documented his observations over the following year. He'd tracked the creature's patterns, its territory, the times of year it seemed most active. The summer months, he'd written, were particularly active periods. In summer, it hunts more frequently. The increased human activity in the forest correlates with increased disappearances. It takes advantage of the season. But there was something else in the journal, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Ashford had written about being observed by the thing, about looking up while hiking and seeing those yellow-green eyes watching him from the trees, about finding tracks, human tracks, that circled his watchtower at night. "It knows I know," he'd written in an entry from March 1971. "It doesn't seem to care. Perhaps it views my observation as insignificant. Perhaps it finds my knowledge of its existence entertaining. There's an intelligence in its eyes when it looks at me, an intelligence that suggests it's thinking thoughts I can't comprehend. I wonder what it sees when it looks at me. Does it see a ranger? A human? A potential meal?" The final entries became increasingly desperate. Ashford wrote about trying to communicate with the creature, attempting to understand its motivations. He wrote about considering confronting it directly. He wrote about his growing certainty that something in the forest was fundamentally wrong with the world as he understood it. The last entry was dated April 14th, 1973. "I'm going into the deep forest tomorrow. I've prepared supplies, not to fight, but to observe more closely, to understand. If something happens to me, if I don't return, please know that I was trying to document the truth. The thing is real. It hunts, thinks, and it will keep hunting as long as humans come into this forest. There must be a way to coexist with it. There must be a way to understand it." There were no more entries after that. Sarah sat in the ruins as darkness fell, holding this journal that was more than 50 years old, and understood what had happened to Robert Ashford. He'd tried to get closer. He'd tried to understand. The Wendigo had killed him for it. The night was the longest of Sarah's life. She built a fire in the ruins of Ashford's watchtower, using stones to create a barrier against the wind. She didn't sleep. She watched the forest and waited, her pistol in her lap, her water supply rationed, her mind racing with fear and questions that had no answers. Around midnight it came. This time it didn't hide. It emerged from the darkness into the firelight, standing at the edge of her visibility, regarding her with those terrible yellow-green eyes. Up close, even from 20 yards away, she could see details she'd missed in the canyon. Its skin was gray and translucent, with what looked like veins visible beneath the surface, glowing with bioluminescence. Its joints were articulated in ways that suggested an evolution that had taken a completely different path from human development. It was both skeletal and somehow muscular, both incredibly thin and radiating a sense of immense strength. It was the most beautiful and most horrifying thing Sarah had ever seen. For what felt like hours, they simply looked at each other. The thing didn't attack, didn't even move. It just observed her, studying her with an intelligence that was undeniable and somehow communicative. There was something in its gaze that suggested recognition, that suggested it knew exactly what she was thinking. Then it did something unexpected. It made a sound that was almost musical, a series of clicks and tones that built into something complex and strange. It took Sarah several seconds to realize what she was hearing. It was trying to communicate. She couldn't understand the words, if they were words, but the intent seemed clear. It was telling her something, explaining something. The way its eyes looked at her, the way its head tilted slightly, it was making a statement that contained meaning beyond her ability to comprehend. For a moment, she felt something shift in her understanding. This thing wasn't evil. It wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. It was simply a predator, occupying the same ecological role that wolves and bears occupied, but on a different level of intelligence. It was an apex hunter in human-level consciousness, nothing more and nothing less. Then it tilted its head in another direction, and in that gesture was a hunger so ancient and profound that Sarah felt it like a physical force. And she understood that comprehension and mercy were not the same thing. The thing retreated. It walked backward into the darkness, its form gradually being consumed by shadow and the depth of night, until finally it was gone. Sarah waited until dawn to leave the watchtower. Part 4. The Escape. The morning of the fourth day was hot and clear. Sarah had survived the night. She still had maybe 12 miles to the trailhead, perhaps more depending on the exact route. She was running low on supplies. She'd intended this to be a 4-day hike and had already exceeded that. But she could make it. Fear and adrenaline were good substitutes for food and water. She packed the journal carefully, knowing it would add weight, knowing she might be making a survival mistake by choosing documentation over a few pounds of food and supplies. But it was Robert Ashford's testimony, and the world needed to know the truth, even if the world didn't believe it. She began descending the ridge, working her way back toward where the trail should be. The forest felt different in daylight, but less threatening than it had in darkness. The summer heat was brutal though, pressing down on her, making every step feel like moving through thick air. By midday, her water was gone. Her lips were cracked. Her body was starting to show signs of heat exhaustion. By her calculations, she should be close to the trail again, close to finding her way out. She allowed herself, for the first time, to believe that escape was possible. That's when she heard the voices. 2 hikers, male and female, their accents suggesting they were European. She could hear their cheerful conversation as they moved through the forest perhaps a quarter-mile away. They were on the main trail, following the same path she'd been on before the encounter in the canyon. Sarah's first instinct was relief. Other people, safety. But almost immediately, that relief transformed into something else. Those people were going to encounter the thing. They were walking directly into hunting grounds, unaware and unprepared. And she knew with certainty that if they did encounter it, they wouldn't escape the way she had. The thing would hunt them because they were there, because they had made themselves available, because the summer heat made it hungry. She had a choice to make. She could make her way quietly south, get to the trailhead, get to safety. She could save herself and leave those hikers to whatever fate awaited them. The thing had let her go. It seemed to have decided she was either not worth eating or worth keeping alive. Either way, she had a chance. Or she could try to warn them. Sarah stood in the forest for a long moment, wrestling with her survival instinct. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to get away, to get to safety, to leave this nightmare behind. She took a breath and shouted, "Turn around! Get off the trail! Get out of here!" The voices stopped. A moment later, one of them called back, "Hello? Who's there? Don't stay on this trail. Turn back. Get out of here." Sarah shouted again, "Go back the way you came. Now. Is someone lost?" The female voice sounded concerned, approaching her. "We have supplies, we can help you." "No, you don't understand." Sarah moved forward, pushing through the trees toward their voices. "You need to get out of this forest. There's something dangerous." She burst through the tree line to see them clearly for the first time. A man and a woman, both probably in their 30s, both wearing new-looking hiking gear that looked barely used. They looked safe, civilized, impossibly far from the reality Sarah now inhabited. "We have a satellite phone," the woman said, reaching for her pack. "We can call for help. Are you injured?" "We need to go," Sarah said. "Right now. Back the way you came. Walk quickly. Don't run unless I tell you to run. But we need to move." The man looked at the woman, and Sarah saw them exchange the look of people who were deciding whether she was sane or genuinely in need of help. "Look," the man said carefully. "We're equipped, we're trained, and we have communication. Why don't we take a minute and you can tell us what's happening?" Sarah's frustration exploded into something close to a scream. "There is no time. There's something in this forest, something that kills people, and if you stay here in this heat, if you stay in this forest, you're going to die." Behind them, maybe 100 yards back down the trail, Sarah saw something shift in the shadows. A large shape, two eyes that glowed yellow-green even in the bright daylight. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. She grabbed the woman's arm. "Now. We move now." What happened next was chaos and terror and the kind of adrenaline-fueled action that Sarah would only be able to piece together later. They started running. The man was yelling something, probably trying to understand what was happening. The woman was asking questions Sarah didn't have time to answer. The thing erupted from the trees behind them, and it was moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. The summer heat seemed to energize it, to make it more aggressive, more hungry. It closed the distance with terrifying speed. The man screamed something that might have been a curse or a prayer, and suddenly he had a knife in his hand. A hiking knife, totally inadequate but better than nothing. He turned to face the creature, and Sarah knew with absolute clarity that he was about to make a sacrifice. "Run!" she yelled at the woman, and she ran herself, pulling at the European woman's arm, dragging her off the trail and into the dense forest on either side. Behind them, they heard the sound of the thing attacking. They heard the man scream, a sound of shocked agony and disbelief. They heard something that sounded like thunder but wasn't, a sound of cosmic wrongness as reality bent around the violence being committed. Sarah didn't look back. She pulled the woman through the undergrowth, over rocks, through thorns and branches. The woman was crying, asking questions that weren't in English, gasping for breath in the oppressive heat. They ran for what felt like forever but was probably only a few minutes. When Sarah finally stopped, she pulled them both behind a massive boulder formation. They crouched there, shaking, hardly breathing, listening. The sounds of the thing moving through the forest gradually faded. It seemed to lose interest quickly once they'd put significant distance between themselves and the kill site. The summer heat was starting to work against it, or perhaps it simply had no interest in pursuing prey that had reached safety. They made their way to the trailhead together, moving slowly and carefully through the brutal afternoon heat, jumping at every sound. Sarah shared her last bit of water with the woman, though it was barely enough for either of them. They staggered out of the forest around 5 in the evening, collapsing at a ranger station where they immediately reported finding a dead hiker. The official search and rescue team found the man's body the next day. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, probably by bears or a large predator. There was no mention of the thing Sarah had seen. There was no investigation into impossible anatomy or the precise, surgical way the body had been torn apart in the afternoon heat. The man's name had been Henrik Soren, and he was 32 years old. His girlfriend survived their encounter and eventually agreed to corroborate Sarah's story, though she did so reluctantly. She didn't want to be known as the woman who'd been attacked by a monster. She wanted her life to go back to normal. But normal for both of them was impossible. Epilogue: the aftermath. Sarah spent 5 days in the hospital, treated for severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and trauma. The psychiatrists diagnosed her with acute stress disorder. They suggested that her ordeal had resulted in confabulation, false memories that had filled in the gaps of what happened with impossible narratives. They were very kind about it, but the implication was clear. She'd hallucinated the Wendigo. She didn't argue with them. She gave her statements to the authorities, describing what she could without mentioning the thing directly. She talked about animal attacks and getting lost and surviving on her wits and luck in the intense summer heat. She mentioned Ashford's journal, but it was never found. Either the forest had reclaimed it, or someone had gone to that watchtower and removed it deliberately. Within 2 weeks, she was released with prescriptions for anti-anxiety medication and a referral to a trauma counselor. Within 2 months, the whole incident had faded from the news cycle. The official report attributed the European hiker's death to a bear attack. The case was closed. Sarah returned to her apartment in Seattle and tried to resume her life. She deleted all her hiking photos from social media. She resigned from her travel writing engagements. She stopped going outside more than necessary. Her friends were concerned, but she couldn't explain the depth of her fear without sounding insane. After 6 months, her therapist suggested she might be recovering. She'd stopped having nightmares most nights. She was eating regularly again. She was holding down a job. But she still woke sometimes with the absolute certainty that it was watching her. She still heard its voice sometimes, that impossible vocalization, in her dreams or in the spaces between waking and sleep. She did eventually write down everything that happened, though she only shared it privately with a small group of people. She published it under a pseudonym online, in the forums where other people shared paranormal experiences. Most responses were skeptical. Some were cruel, suggesting she was either lying or delusional. But some responses came from other people who had survived encounters in those mountains. People whose stories corroborated hers in small, specific ways. People who had seen the yellow-green eyes in summer darkness. People who had heard that impossible voice. People who had escaped during the heat of afternoon or the cool of night. People who had gotten lucky. In the years that followed, Sarah learned that the Wendigo was far more common in native traditions than she'd realized. It wasn't just the mountains of Colorado. It existed in forests across North America, in Canada, in the deep woods of the eastern states, in places where the wilderness still held territories completely separate from human civilization. It had been there longer than humans. It would be there long after humans left. Some nights, Sarah wondered if it had let her go because it had some greater plan. Some nights, she wondered if it was still out there, in those mountains where she'd nearly died, watching her, remembering her. Most nights, she just tried to sleep in her air-conditioned apartment and tried not to think about the summer heat in the forests of Colorado. She tried not to remember the feel of that creature's attention, that vast and hungry intelligence tracking her through the wilderness. She never went hiking again. She never set foot in that forest again. But sometimes, on hot summer nights when the temperature wouldn't drop and the air felt thick and oppressive, she'd look out her window and see, just for a moment, the glow of yellow-green eyes watching from the darkness beyond. And she'd know that some predators don't stop hunting just because you've escaped. Some predators thrive in the heat and the endless season of summer. Some predators have very long memories. Some predators have forever. This account was taken from personal interviews with the survivor, supplemented by official records and third-party corroboration. The name of the primary subject has been changed to protect privacy. Readers are advised that venturing into remote wilderness areas carries risks that extend beyond those described in official safety guidelines. The forest remembers. And some things in the forest are very, very hungry.